Good morning. A very warm welcome to all of you, and particularly to our chief guest, the Honorable External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, Honorable Chancellor, Dr. S.B. Majumdar Sir, Honorable Pro-Chancellor, Dr. Vidya Yaravdekar Ma'am, Honorable Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Raman, the distinguished speaker delegates, officers from the Ministry of External Affairs, the young trainee officers from the ministry, deans, directors, the media, and of course, a large number of students. Again, a very warm welcome to the 9th edition of the International Relations Conference. Time is short, so I'm just going to keep it very short and brief. Ma'am, please let me invite you to deliver your opening remarks.
The chief guest for this year's International Relations Conference, Honorable External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar ji, the Chancellor of this university, Dr. Majumdar, the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Raman, Shivali, the lead woman behind this conference, Mrs. Majumdar, distinguished guests, and my dear bright young students and also officers from the Sushma Swaraj Academy for in the MEA, and of course the MEA officials accompanying the Honorable Minister. Sir, it gives us great pleasure to welcome you once again to the Symbiosis International University. You were here in February for one of the G20 talks, which we called as Festival of Thinkers, and at that time we had requested you to come back again for this International Relations Conference, the theme of which you appreciated, the India Strategic Culture, addressing global and regional issues. We have been having these conferences since 2013. In fact, international relations is a subject close to my heart. And when we decided to establish the Symbiosis School of International Studies, we didn't start the MA International Relations program immediately. We started off with having conferences, almost like a think tank, having discussions, deliberations, and roundtables. And in 2013, I remember, in fact, in 2012, I remember, during my interactions with MEA, I said very boldly, though then, that international relations discussions should move out of Delhi elsewhere in India. And I think it was appreciated by a few people in the MEA, because the subject is close to my heart and I have attended a lot of sessions, what I saw was that many a times venues changed, topics changed, but audiences and speakers probably remain the same. And I felt it was more of the young people in a city like Pune, which houses so many educational institutions, needs to know what India's foreign policy is, what are the discussions taking place in international relations, and how they would affect a common man's life, and of course, life in businesses, trade, etc. And therefore, the industry and the students were very happy when we moved out of Delhi to get these discussions in Pune. And since 2013, we've been having these conferences with MEA on various topics. Earlier, of course, these were limited to different regions like Africa, West Asia, India's Look East, Act East policy, India's development partnership assistance, etc. But in 2018, we first spoke about shaping a new strategic culture for India. At that time, of course, we did it with a few stalwarts from MEA and former Indian ambassadors, as well as some of the historians. But then we thought that we would take this to the next level in this conference in 2023. I'm very happy to say that we have had deep engagements with the MEA. And so thank you very much for sparing your valuable time in helping us to chart out these sessions, even identifying some of the speakers. And we've got a galaxy of speakers, and many of them being academics, not just from India, but from outside India. I'm not going to take much time because we're here to listen to two erudite speakers, one Dr. Majumdar, who's actually lived the philosophy of how to promote Indian strategic culture through education, I would say, and of course the Honorable EAM. And therefore, once again, I welcome all the dignitaries, students from not just Symbiosis, but various institutions across Maharashtra, and industry personnel, and of course our young budding IFS officers. Once again, welcome you to this beautiful campus. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vidya. I will now request our Honorable Chancellor, Dr. S.B. Mazumdar, to deliver his welcome address.
Namaste to all of you. Dr. Jaishankar, Dr. Vidya, Dr. Raman, most distinguished guests, officers, ambassadors, and most importantly, my dear, dear, dear students. I'm happy that External Affairs Minister has personally come to deliver a keynote address on the theme of the conference. Good morning to all of you. Vidya asked me to explain how culture is more important in foreign policy. Well, let me begin with how Symbiosis was started. In fact, Symbiosis was first Symbiosis International Cultural Center. It was out of a coincidence that I realized that a foreign student is an ambassador of our country. And I realized this when I was professor of botany at Ferguson College. Well, there were many foreign students even in 1969-70. In fact, there were 800 foreign students from 32 different countries, mostly Afro-Asian. They had a number of problems. Admissions, accommodations, but more than that, homesickness and indifference of Pune citizens to these Afro-Asian students. I will give you an example how Puneites used to treat foreign students in those days. There was a student named Patrick Osuasa from Ghana, and he was staying in Film Institute of India. When I went there to interview him, he said, Dr. Mazumdar, I would like to run away from Pune as early as possible. I asked him why. He said, when I get up early in the morning, I can go to the toilet. Your students turn their eyes or close their eyes or turn their heads. Why? Because I am black. When I travel in your local buses, even if there is a space beside me, your girls would prefer to stand rather than to sit beside me. Why? Because I am black. I thought if these are the feelings of foreign students who are in Pune during their student days, what impressions they will carry back to their own countries. And so a small organization was born in a small room in my house on the campus of Ferguson College. And I, being a professor of botany, I named it as Symbiosis, which essentially means mutualism, which means when two different plants and animals live together by helping each other, that association is called symbiosis. So I thought that, and then there was no dialogue between foreign and Indian students. So I thought that in order to bring them together, I started many cultural programs so that foreign and Indian students will come together on one stage. That is how the small organization was started. And as I told you, culture was the soul of that organization, which brought foreign students together, which created dialogue between foreign and Indian students. It had so happened that after the cultural programs, again there was segregation between foreign and Indian students. So in order to bring them together on a longer basis, we started colleges, many education institutions. And the first institution that we started was English Language Teaching Institute, because many of the foreign students were not proficient in English. They could not understand the class lectures, so on and so on. So when we started educational institutions, not only foreign students from different countries, but also students from different states of India. And that is how Symbiosis International Cultural Center was metamorphosed into educational institution. Later on, of course, in 2002, Symbiosis University was also created. My point is, it's a culture of togetherness. When foreign and Indian students come together, they develop some kind of not only friendship, but in a way brotherhood. And so, a quality education, good cultural activities, ultimately would lead to national integration. So this is how culture has also something to do with education institution, and an educational institution can create a tremendous goodwill for our country. Today, many foreign students who studied in Symbiosis are occupying important positions in their countries, vital positions in their countries, and that is how Symbiosis is contributing to the cultural strategy of our country. I do not want to take much of your time, but the essence is Symbiosis stands for mutualism, Symbiosis stands for togetherness, and in fact, Symbiosis wants to create global citizens. Global citizens, and the most important point is we want to create a system which will promote for our country Eastern wisdom and Western dynamism. So Eastern wisdom and Western dynamism is what we want to inculcate among the students. I do not want to take much of your time. Thank you. I would permit me, sir, to tell the audience what we do, especially to newly arrived foreign students. My dear international brothers and sisters, welcome to India welcome to Pune, welcome to Symbiosis. You are in a country where no one is a foreigner, where all human beings, where all human races for ages are living together. You are in a country where teacher, mother, and father are gods. And do you know where you, the guest, too, is regarded as the god. You are in a country where women are worshipped and not merely loved. You are in a country where nothing shines like the shyness of a woman. You are in a country where the poverty and nobility live together, where poor great are more remembered than kings and monarchs, where sacred stones are costlier and greater than the costliest diamonds. You are in a country where right is a might, humility is not a weakness, and where knowledge is power. You are in a country where saints have noble past, but sinners have noble future. Into this country, my international brothers and sisters, may your stay become happier and your mind nobler and broader. This is the message which I give every year to every foreign students coming to Symbiosis. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I will now invite the Honorable External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, to deliver his keynote address.
Dr. S.P. Majumdar, founder and president of Symbiosis. Dr. Vidya Yaravdekar, Pro-Chancellor and Principal Director. Dr. Ramakrishnan Raman, Vice-Chancellor. Friends, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be back in Symbiosis. The last time we were here, we discussed how this conference could be held on this particular theme. So for me, it is a matter of particular satisfaction that a discussion of the previous visit has today materialized in the next one. We have gathered here at this international conference to discuss India's strategic culture, or if I could put it in a slightly different way, how do we create and propagate an international relations with Indian characteristics. Now, when we formulated the program, I'd actually thought I could, at the beginning of the conference, perhaps frame the issues from my perspective for the conference to consider at length. But once I started putting my own thoughts down on paper, I found they were a bit longer than I expected. So if I go beyond that 15 minutes, please bear with me today. Why do we need Indian strategic thought? Why do we need Indian characteristics? I think the answer, in a way, is in the last year, this year, as we went through the G20. The G20 is a statement of rebalancing, that the premier gathering of the world used to be G7. About 15 years ago, when there was a global financial crisis, the G7 couldn't handle the problem by themselves. They needed to bring in other countries, including us, China, and a few others. And so the G7, in a sense, though it still exists, got replaced by the G20. Now, it spoke about the economic rebalancing in the world. And over the years, there has also been a political rebalancing in the world. So if you look at the big political discussions and debates, many more countries shape it and participate in it than perhaps they did a few decades ago. But it's not just who is talking. It is also what are they talking, whose terms are they using, what is the narrative, what are the metaphors, what are the terms in which the conversation is taking place, what are the concepts. And that is where, if we reflect on it, you realized that the world perhaps has not changed as much as we think it is. And let me give you an example. Today, one of the big issues in global politics is the competition between US and China. Now, the term which is frequently used, especially on the Chinese side, to communicate the predicament or the challenge, the term used is Thucydides' trap. So think about it. A 5,000-year civilization is using a Greek historian or a Greek historian's construct as a metaphor to communicate with another country. And ask yourself what a power of narrative this is. That though we still think in terms of today the West not being as dominant as it is, to communicate our basic views and concerns, we still fall back on a terminology which is so deeply Western. Now, I use that as an example, but in our everyday lives, we use Pyrrhic victory, we use Gordian knot, we use Trojan horse. We have actually, these are not just used, they have been universalized in a way. So I emphasize this because today, these words, these concepts, these metaphors, this is really what power is about. So the economics may have shifted, the politics may be shifting, but if the culture doesn't move alongside these shifts, then those shifts will always remain incomplete or mitigated in different ways. So again, let me share with you a different set of examples to illustrate the power of the narrative. The world, as my first point was made, is still significantly Western in terms of its intellectual concepts, traditions, and construct. And when we say Western, a large part of it is actually British, because in the last 250 years, among the Western powers, actually the British, in many ways, purely in some way derived from the fact that they were the most extensive empire, they have actually shaped the great debates and the conversations. Now, interestingly, if you look at the way thoughts in history, political science, international relations are unfolded, Westerners generally, and the British actually, have put themselves to be successors of Greeks and Romans. That they have actually worked history backwards. I mean, if you think of Romans and Britain, actually the history is very different. It wasn't exactly a successor's history. Yet, once actually empire building exercise started, and then you needed legitimacy, you needed justification, you need narrative, you needed a rationalization. They created this whole, I would say, legacy of wisdom and knowledge and thought and philosophy, of which, of course, they made themselves the inheritors and thereafter the propagators, and clearly the beneficiaries. But it wasn't just about themselves. If you look at how actually the relationship between geopolitics and, again, historical assumptions. You have, it's a very interesting comparison. how world history, and I would say more than history, international relations, the comparative treatment of China and India. Some of you would be familiar with Kissinger's book on China. The standard Western, we are now talking professors, intellectuals, practitioners. They have no problem accepting 5,000 years of unbroken Chinese history. And yet many of them, again, thanks to the British interest in propagating it at that time and the larger Western buy-in as well to that, they would not give that same privilege or that same understanding to India. In fact, the extreme example of that was Churchill himself, who said India is no more a country than the equator. But I put it to you that there has been and there will always be a strong correlation between power, politics, concepts, and actually history and international relations. That the same people who would airbrush history and attribute continuity when it suits them. Because remember, for Western countries, for much of the 20th century and 19th and 20th century, they actually had a vested interest in preserving a China as a bulwark against Russia, against Tsarist Russia, and then later on against communist Soviet Union. But when it doesn't suit them, they can actually break up your history, assign to you, definition and identity. They can make regional into national, but when it suits them, they can do exactly the opposite. That is actually the debate when we speak about cultural rebalancing, when we speak about intellectual power, when we speak about shaping the narrative. That is what it is really about. Now, stop a moment and reflect on, when we say international relations, philosophy, history, who are the thinkers who naturally come to our mind? What would you normally use in your curriculum? You will say, okay, Greek philosophers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato. You will speak about Roman, so much actually of Roman history has become mainstreamed into global thinking. We will speak in the modern era of European statesmen. People would quote Palmerston on permanent interest, but not remember that Kautilya said it many hundreds of years before that. And, again, to some extent, those who have made an effort, again, I'm using China as a ready comparison. To some extent, a Sun Tzu or a Zhuge Liang would be accommodated. But how often in international literature do you see a Chanakya or a Banabhat or a Tuluvallavar mentioned? Almost never. Now, thinkers, yes. So let me go beyond that. Look at epics. Again, when people speak global epics, what comes to your mind? Iliad, Odyssey. In fact, Odyssey has become a word with a small o, so that it has actually entered our terminology so deeply that we use it for a difficult journey. When we think of statecraft, Machiavelli and Prince, more modern era, Clausewitz on war. Now, there are other cultures, other civilizations who have, in their own way, also tried to assert their history and legacy. I refer to China, Art of War, or Three Kingdoms. The Japanese, for example, have this very great epic called Heike Monogatari, but it has largely stayed very regional, in part because the Japanese themselves have not developed such a strong external narrative. A country like Iran has Najul Balaga, how Hazrat Ali in a sense, his life and the lessons from it. But just like I said, when it comes to thinkers, whether it's Arthashastra, whether it's Niti Shastra, whether it's Harsha Charita, or whether it is even Ramayana and Mahabharata, people look at Ramayana and Mahabharata essentially as cultural tales. It is not often that in the world of IR, we think of them as strategic expressions or actually examples of statecraft. And this is something I will dwell upon in a little more detail later on. So you have thinkers where, in a sense, the dice is loaded against you. You have these big epics and books. So let's look at people. Because at the end of the day, with societies, where, our imaginations are finally shaped by people and stories about people. So if you say, okay, let's think about the big figures of history. Oh, who would come to mind? Alexander the Great, okay, Napoleon. If you're in the world of diplomacy, Metternich, Talleyrand, or in the last 50 years, Henry Kissinger. Now, some time ago, in a different context, I actually made the statement that I actually think that Hanuman and Sri Krishna are great diplomats. And I meant it not as a throwaway remark, but as something which emanated from a consideration of actually their role in our epics. But think of our own, and I'm not even going way back in history. I'm talking relatively recent history. Think of Maharaj Shivaji, Ranjit Singh, Krishna Devaraya, Lachit Borphukan. So the question I have is, if we are actually to develop an Indian strategic culture, if we are to create international relations with Indian characteristics, is it not necessary that we actually devote more time, attention, energies to look at our own reservoir of history, knowledge, culture, and traditions? And I would relate an experience I had. This was about a decade ago. And I was talking at that time to my, I'd say, counterparts or colleagues in the US administration. And we were talking Afghanistan. And I found that after 20 years of being in Afghanistan, so much of the American understanding of Afghanistan was actually molded by what was the British narrative of Afghanistan. So when I actually asked them that, does it occur to you, have you ever thought why Peshawar is where it is? I mean, was the Durand Line actually something which was a British colonial construct? Was there a historical basis for why there was a certain separation there? Or, a figure like Hari Singh Nalwa. People who had spent their lifetime in Afghanistan never heard of him. And that told you something. It told you that they had actually looked at a geography from one cultural lens. And unless today we are able to put our lens in place, they will never look at it in a way in which it will serve our interests or converge even partially with what we are thinking. Now, why have we come to this situation? I think for a variety of reasons. In a way, as you would have guessed by now from my repeated emphasis on Western construct, a lot of it is a natural consequence of hegemonism. That if out of the last 300 plus years, Western powers have been globally dominant. If they have been hegemonic, for them, superior powers means superior ideas, it means superior constructs. In a way, it means superior history. So, it is the intellectual domination which comes from that era, which still continues even if political and economic changes have happened since the Second World War. A second reason is actually ourselves. That if you look at the last, I would say, century, especially in Asia, a lot Asians themselves, Asian polities, Asian leaders have associated modernism, modernizing, with westernizing. That they have in many cases sought to put their own cultures behind them, because in their assessment, their cultures failed them when it came to resisting the West. So if you look at Meiji Restoration in Japan, or you start the period of Republican China and thereafter into Communist China, or if you look at us after independence, there is actually almost a sense that, my past is behind me, I'm now going to enter a new phase. My new phase must be closer to those who actually have been dominating the world. So there is a conscious or sometimes unconscious imbibing and emulating of Western constructs as a way, actually as a prescription of progress. So hegemonism has had its impact. I would say modernism has had its impact. To some extent, the politics of the day. It is natural, perhaps, though I would say it is excessive at times, where the requirement of the politics actually distanced us from our own history. That let us take, India post-independence. The belief really was that, our foreign policy largely emanated from the thinking of our first Prime Minister. And that, in fact, the first Prime Minister himself in interviews, Pandit Nehru has said that a lot of our foreign policy actually is the thinking of the Indian National Congress. Now, he's partially right, but he's partially not. Because there were many other players, many other factors, many other forces, which actually also shaped our thinking. And by the way, shaped the thinking of the world about us. So it was, if I were to say today, if one takes the totality of, if we put politics for a moment aside, re-examine our own near past with a much more objective and, I would say, dispassionate view, you will see that, our record is much more complex. Our thinking is much more nuanced. The forces at work are much more diverse than what often we are led to believe, including in our textbooks. So let me give you a few examples. We think in terms of, who opposed colonialism. Broadly in our minds, there is the 1857 revolt, and then there's the national movement. In reality, actually, there was prolonged regional, local resistance which expressed itself in many, many ways. So if we have a history which does not give Birsa Munda its due or Alluri Sitarama Raju in Andhra their due, if we keep it as a centralized narrative, I think in many ways we ourselves are not recognizing the fullness of forces within India. Or apart from the national movement, there's a very interesting book. I don't know if Sanjeev Sanyal is here. He's just brought out a book called The Revolutionaries, about people who actually put pressure on the British system in other ways. Now, we could argue how effective it was, but the fact was it was there. It was real. It had an impact actually internationally. That these were people who took the Indian cause both into East Asia, Southeast Asia, who took it into Germany, and later on, in fact, the INA, the Netaji phase actually built on a legacy foundation which many of these people laid. Or even two figures, very obvious examples. Every one of us in the room recognizes them. Swami Vivekananda and Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. We think of them as a philosopher and as a great, talented writer, artist, cultural figure. But they were very powerful agents of international perception about India. That they took our cause out, they shaped the world's thinking about us as well. So in a way, they were unconscious diplomats of their era. Or I would even say, at that time, many of the Maharajas of India. Because again, we have all been conditioned to think of the Maharajas as largely retrogressive people. Because it fitted the politics of the day after 1947 that they be so portrayed. But the reality, and there is a lot of literature and other evidence to back it up, that you actually had very progressive Maharajas, many of whom actually tried to create as much space for themselves and for their kingdoms and their people from British rule as possible. So it wasn't that actually the princely states were necessarily the backward parts of India. In many cases, a lot of the advancement of India, including industrialization in India, actually took place in princely states. So I point this to you, and in fact, another account which comes to my mind is Rahul Sagar's recent book, that the 19th century origins of nationalism in India. So when we think, in fact, of our own history, of what are we about, how have we got to where we are, what are the forces which drove us, I think it's important today to look at all of this, if necessary, with fresh eyes, with an open mind, revisit history, and then really see how do we use the totality of what we have before us as a way of engaging the world. Now, in a way, I've spoken of history. Let me move to slightly more contemporary period. Let's look even at our foreign policy record. It would be very rare to read an account of our foreign policy which is truly critical. Because if you read most accounts, it's like we've had success after success. It's not exactly true. So there are occasions, there are policies, there are choices, which today, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, we must revisit. There was recently, not recently actually, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a book by an American professor called Francine Frankel, called When Nehru Looks East. It examines a set of decisions and then comments on those decisions, obviously with the benefit of subsequent events in mind, but not entirely so. It gives you the forces which pushed for the choice to be made and what were the debates of that time. And they are very, some of them are really very, very interesting. Like what happens, for example, when we take our case on Jammu and Kashmir to the United Nations, and why it ended up the way it did, and who were the players who took it in that direction. So I would say today that it's important, on the one hand, to look at the choices we made. I would certainly say the choice we made in 1954 with respect to China. The choices during the 1962 war, I recently saw a comment in a newspaper about that. Could we have done differently? Could we have done better? The choice in 1972 about how we were going to proceed with Pakistan. So it's important today not to assume these were inevitable, or not to assume that they were the best choices. I mean, these are choices made. We cannot undo those choices. But there are lessons learned from the dissection of these choices. But more than choices, I would even say policies. You know, for us, if we are to really look today at Indian foreign policy, a lot of it should also be on the roads not taken. That if one were to look today at someone like Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee, I mean, it's interesting. The critics of Indian foreign policy often were real-time critics. This is not a case of looking back after 20, 30 years and saying you got the decision right because I have the benefit of 20 years of events thereafter. At that time, when events were happening, there were people who put alternatives on the table. If you look, for example, at our Pakistan policy, at the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, and subsequently, and frankly, at our handling of Kashmir, you have actually a minister of the first cabinet who leaves the government because he has profound differences on the entirety of the Pakistan policy, and that's Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee, and who actually at that time cautions Nehru about going to the UN on Kashmir. A second case is Sardar Patel himself. You know, there is this very famous exchange of views he has had with Pandit Nehru on China, that where he has given a strategic assessment of China, and Nehru, in a way, doesn't respond directly to him, but he does respond, who puts an alternative strategic assessment. So now, come 1962, many people would have said, oh, maybe Patel got it better. But Patel wrote this not in 1962, he wrote it in 1950. So it was not that the options and the thought processes were not there. Oh, today when I was looking at that film before we came in, and I thought of, you know, in the center dedicated to Dr. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar actually has spoken at some length and written at some length about the reasons, you know, when he quit the cabinet as well. A lot of them had to do with domestic policy. But interestingly, one of them had to do with foreign policy, which is he differed profoundly with the way in which the government of the day was handling the United States. That he felt that we were unnecessarily getting into problems with the United States, actually by taking up the cause of China. So we were putting, I mean, this is not exactly the phrase he uses, but essentially he implies that we are putting China's interests ahead of India's interests when it comes to dealing with the United States. Or even if one looks at non-alignment, that non-alignment was meant as a statement of independence and a way of creating our space. But the fact is that at some stage, it became like being at the center for the sake of being at the center. That itself became the end objective. So when our national interests sometimes warranted leaning on one side or cutting a deal, we were hesitant to do so. So the tactics, in a sense, became strategy, and that clouded our vision. So I mention all this to you because, to my mind, if we are today to proceed with Indian strategic thought, if we are to assess international relations and view it from our own viewpoint, it is necessary, first of all, that we ourselves be less theological and less dogmatic and frankly less laudatory about our own record. That we need to examine our own record with a much more critical eye And I say this because, to me, the last of these causes why we, in a sense, we are prisoners of a larger construct which we do not control. Today is not just hegemonism, not just modernism, not just politics of the day, not the subjectivism that I spoke about. It is actually globalism. That in a globalized world, the nature of the world today is such that the pressure for political correctness, for deciding what is right, what is wrong, for painting political forces, governments, people as outliers, while suggesting this is the norm, and this is the norm that the world has agreed upon, and if you disagree with me, you are the outlier, you cannot possibly be right, because as the custodian of globalism, there is one truth, I am the custodian of that truth, and it is a very, very clever way today of legitimizing and delegitimizing debaters. So this, I thought, were some considerations regarding our own record in foreign policy. Now, I had mentioned epics. And again, many of you would be familiar. There is a deep belief in many quarters, and there's a gentleman called George Stanham who very conveniently articulated it for our benefit, that the Indians really don't have strategic thought. Now, of course, it's a slight improvement on people who said India is not a country at all. But still, the belief that, somebody could have existed for 5,000 years and not have strategic thought. But here you have an eminent person from New World who now says, okay, these guys somehow survived history, but they did it without strategic thought or strategic culture. So some years ago, at actually the encouragement of one of our former foreign secretaries, a gentleman called Maharaj Kishan Raskotra, I spoke about how, to my mind, the Mahabharata was a distillation of strategic concepts, and that it is in the Indian culture often, because it's a predominantly oral culture, there is a lot out there. It may not be as explicitly brought out as, let us say, the Western culture would tend to do, but nevertheless, those deep concepts and those practices are very much there. And that eventually ended up as a chapter in the book that I brought out in 2020. Now, among I would say the principles or thoughts of international relations which I found in the Mahabharata were obviously the dilemma of choices and the collateral damage which accompanies every choice, the constraints on competition. In the Mahabharata, these are largely emotional or social constraints or ethical constraints. Today, they can often be economic or technology constraints. The importance of strategic patience to know when to do something or not to do something. And the example I've cited is Lord Krishna's forbearance in regard to Shishupal. Or how to assess power. The choice, the dilemma, which actually the non-dilemma which Arjun faced, which was to choose Krishna or his army. And he knew which one to choose. Duryodhan didn't. Or the idea of balance of power. That when the Pandavas were taking out Jarasandh, they actually calculated what the consequences of it would be to weaken his allies so that then the successful crowning of Yudhishthira as emperor could take place. The idea of, the whole realpolitik versus credibility, which is, are there norms? If there are norms, what are the costs of violating norms? And of course, Yudhishthira's own credibility and dilemma is the sharpest examples. But the fact is, if you don't have a good reputation, then it's difficult to even make exceptions. So my conclusion was that reputation actually has a value even in the world of real politics. Or the problems of single-minded adversaries, that if you have an adversary, a neighbor, for instance, who is single-minded about damaging you, it is a genuine problem. And Arjun's own, one of the reasons he's diverted away and Abhimanyu has to go in his place is largely because he's challenged by Shusharma and the Trigats to combat, and he cannot refuse them, and they go after him single-mindedly because they have an old grudge. Or indeed, the dilemmas of hedging, or I would say non-alignment, the fact you have a few kings who stayed out of the fight, or those who made up their minds in a very unsatisfactory way. So you had Rukma who stayed out, Balram who stayed out, or Shalya who ended up on the wrong side in a way, he was deceived into it. Or actually, if you look at it, the very thought, I would say the reality of the Pandavas who are actually disadvantaged. That if you see the Kaurav-Pandav balance, it is 11-7 in favor of the Kauravas. And yet actually the lesser force is able to defeat the larger force, and there are reasons for it. So at that time I had sought to distill from that something which is applicable in a more modern and contemporary way. That it is not just a nice tale to be read. There are actually practical lessons for analysts and practitioners of international relations to draw from that. Now, at some point, somebody kind of asked me whether the logic would hold true for the Ramayana as well. And think about it, because when we speak today of creating narratives, of having, our constructs, our analogies, our hero figures, our situations, Ramayana is actually about an expeditionary force and about creating a coalition and about managing a coalition. And it is underpinned by regime change. The regime of Vali is changed to the regime of Sugriv. So how much more contemporary can it get? Or if you look at it, Lord Ram is actually the rising power. And he is trying to espouse, uphold a rules-based order. And he's doing it in a very turbulent and unpredictable world, which is full of Rakshasas who are disturbing, who are creating regional problems in a way. And he really, in pursuance of a duty to global commons, actually has to go into different situations and try to bring about global good. And if you see, as I said, the examples of diplomats, Hanuman is one, but Angad is one, even his mother Tara is one. Or if you look, you speak of a Thucydides trap. If you look in terms of parity of contestants, you have between the entrenched Rishi, Vashisht, and the rising Rishi, Vishwamitra, a very fierce competition for parity and for acknowledgement of parity. So there is, or if you look even at Ravana's own predicament, Ravana's quest is for total security. But in the quest for total security, he has secured himself against everybody except the one force he thinks is too weak to damage. And those are the humans. So the concepts are there. If we looked at it with the right view, around us, in our own culture. Today, we talk about how, bad bets, let us say, which the United States made strategically in the last 30, 40 years, which have allowed counter forces to come up. Look at the boons which King Dashrath has granted his wife, and the fact that he has actually allowed a certain vulnerability to be used against him. So I put to you the proposition that once we decide that we have a desire, an ability to create a certain account, as I said, put forward a narrative, look for analogies and examples. We can find them. They're all around us. It's just we are not necessarily aware to these possibilities. So how do we actually today, as India, create this narrative? One part of it is what I'm telling you, but there's a practical part to it as well. So because it's not at the end of the day a debate, it is also a diplomacy, it is a negotiation, there are transactions. So we do this in a variety of ways. One by putting India as a source of initiatives. If you look at the last decade, you've had the International Solar Alliance, you've had the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Recently, we had the International Day of Yoga. I mean, I cannot, I must tell you, you have no idea how powerful the propagation of yoga has been in terms of enhancing and penetrating our branding in global society. Today, the propagation, the idea of International Year of Millets, that people are upholding the cause of the millets, I can tell you, goes down very, very well in the global south, especially in Africa, which is historically a millet-eating society, except that millets got like intellectual hegemonism. When it came to grain hegemonism, millets got driven out by wheat. That today millets are staging a comeback. And we need today we are seen today as leaders, we are a millet revolutionary power. That, the idea of even sustainable lifestyle, that the life initiative, that we can actually live a much more environment-friendly life. So one is how to be a continuous source of, of initiatives at a global level, which is molding the thinking and the activities of our era. The second, of course, is terminology, concepts. And you saw that, starting with one which this institution identifies itself with, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So this one earth, one family, one future. Believe me, it has stuck not just with those 20 nations and the 9 guest countries and the international organizations. It has stuck with the world that, okay, the Indians think it is one family. Or, in fact, our own sense, we have today tried to find a term which would explain that we are not, we don't want to say that we are uninvolved, but we don't want to say we are part of an alliance, that we have the freedom, the flexibility. So you can say multi-alignment, multi-vector, multi-axis. I would say, and I wouldn't say, actually the Prime Minister said, Vishwamitra. So the idea that we are not necessarily, we are there in a not necessarily in an opportunistic sense, but we have the space and the flexibility and the independence to play a much bigger role. Or when it comes to specific domains, today the branding of being a pharmacy of the world, even the idea of using digital for development, or as I said, pushing the message of the need for a voice of the global south. In fact, this year I would say I've probably the two words in international relations which have made the greatest impact are the words Global South. They're not original words, but they were there somewhere in the recesses of some diplomatic cupboard. Today, those words, Global South, even the people against Global South use the word Global South. So that is the power of the narrative. So, sometimes it can be for ourselves that we've had islands, to our south in the Indian Ocean. Even bureaucratically, actually, we used to deal with them as separate countries in the MEA as separate divisions. Today, the idea of a policy called Sagar and bringing all the islands into one rubric, which allows a much more consolidated, cohesive way of dealing with them. Or if one looks, the people speak about the global marketplace. Our interests demand we speak about the global workplace, where mobility should be a norm. Mobility should not be some special favor that you are doing to people by giving them a particular category of visas. It should be normalized. So these are the contestations in which we need to engage in. But it's not enough to engage in that. We have to popularize it, we have to internalize it. We have to, as I say, first of all, convince ourselves. So how to do that? I would come to it. To me, at the end of the day, a lot of it has to be academic and intellectual rigor, because there has to be a body of knowledge which will back up that popularization. It has to be practiced as well. So in a sense, that thinking has to be internalized within the foreign service and within the government and within the practitioners of diplomacy. But how do you, in a sense, acculturize it? How do you popularize it? How do you create the stories? So when I speak about, big heroes, these big heroes, we have to get them into a popular mindset, just like other cultures and civilizations have done for their heroes. And it's when we believe in our heroes that we can get the world to believe in our heroes. So, to me, this, the task before us in many ways is really to create a certain body of knowledge with a strong sense of rigor, to simultaneously strengthen it by a practice of diplomacy with our own thoughts. I'm not, again, this is not being xenophobic or being insular. I'm not saying in any way that the world's thoughts are irrelevant. I'm looking actually for being more global, but going there on the global stage with cards in my hands, not playing on other people's, not playing, as they say, away games all the time. I want to play games at home too, and games at home too on my terms, or at least partially on my terms, on my concepts, on my narratives. So how do we popularize? How do we acculturize? How do we project? What are the stories we tell? And it's important here that we harmonize, because all of this, anybody looking at it would say, yes, this is very nationalistic. And it is. But nationalism and internationalism are not necessarily contradictory. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is proof of that. It may be contradictory in the Western, in a Western intellectual, in many Western countries, in fact, the word nationalist is a very pejorative word. But in our country, it is not, and there's a historical reason why it is not. So the point I make is that today, the challenge for us as we look at Indian strategic thought is one is the academic, intellectual research side of it. Side by side, the practice of it, the diplomacy of it, the policy of it. Then the projection of it, the imbibing of it, in a way, the various mediums, a film or, as I said, a book or a film can be equally impactful as an academic paper. And now there will be challenges. There will be people who would regard some of this as, in a sense, being, I would say, mythical or revisionist or medieval even. But it's important that we like other, certainly the cultures of major powers, that we draw much more fully on our heritage and traditions. That is not against our future. On the contrary, I would argue that our future will never really flower in that way unless we have our own cultural foundations. And to do this, certainly, the present will be contested, the near past would be contested, if we are to have a debate about the future. How do we bring about a global narrative? As I said, at the end of the day, it will be about whose terms, whose rules. Those will be the perennial question. So I would end with this assertion that today Bharat needs its narrative, and it needs its narrative not just for itself. If we are to be one of the voices of the global south, if rebalancing is really to get more traction, if we are to see a world in the next 50 years which is significantly different from the world of the last 50 years, then it's important that we address not just the economics and the politics and the technology of that world, all of which are hugely critical, but side by side look at the cultural history, traditions, political science, and international relations. That is certainly the kind of vision when we speak about the Amrit Kal. This, I think, is one of the big tasks that await us in the Amrit Kal. And I'm particularly pleased today that to have such a large body of students, because I think the Amrit Kal is your call, and also to have the latest cohort of the Indian Foreign Service, because as I told them, we can frame the question. It is for them in the course of the next 25 years to come up with the answers. So once again, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, sir. I will request our Honorable Chancellor, Dr. S.P. Muzumdar, sir, to felicitate the Honorable Minister.
This is a statue of a common man that we would like you to be felicitated with. R.K. Lakshman was a very dear friend of Dr. Muzumdar, and we see the common man statue at one of our city campuses standing very tall. So this is a replica that you are a minister, but a person who has dedicated your life for the common man.
May I request the dignitaries to proceed to inaugurate the plaque. Actually, it's the center, the plaque for the center, Symbiosis Center for the Promotion of the Philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. As you all know, it's the philosophy that is at the foundation, is the basis of symbiosis. Dr. Muzumdar established Symbiosis in 1971 with this motto, and we want to promote this philosophy through the center. I would also like to mention here that we have a 2-credit course on Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. the Honorable Minister to felicitate our 3 young students. So we had a research conclave on the very theme of Indian strategic thought. This was basically to promote the idea and also to take it to our young students. So there are 3 winners, and I would like to announce the names. Ms. Rucha Mapari from Manipal University. Ananya Singh from Flame University. And finally, Anaka Thampi from the Symbiosis School of International Studies. Thank you very much, sir. I will now request Vice Chancellor Professor Raman to deliver his vote of thanks.
The Chief Guest for today, Dr. S. Jaishankar, Honorable External Affairs Minister, Government of India, Honorable Chancellor, Dr. S.B. Mujumdar, sir, Honorable Pro-Chancellor, Dr. Vidya Ayurvedika, Dr. Shivali Lovely, who's the Director of SIS and the person behind executing this conference, MEA officials, deans, directors, faculty members, staff members, and students, and all other dignitaries of the dais. Thank you all who are here for this inaugural session of IRC 2023. Minister, you are a great influencer and a role model for several thousand students of Symbiosis. In fact, the hall is so jam-packed and we have several thousands who are also seeing this online, which is being streamed. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invite and also ensuring that the Policy Planning and Research Division of Ministry of External Affairs to be associated with the IRC 2023. I'll keep it short, giving this vote of thanks. You started your speech with terminologies used in communications and their link to culture. You spoke about how the Western influence and the influence of British is shaping the narrative of culture, how it has happened. You gave several examples of how we are made to think with narratives that you gave. How and why is it important to look at the reservoir of our own history and tradition, and how association of modernization with westernization is shaping the thought process of many. You also spoke of why is it important to look at our own history and not have the centralized narrative which we are conditioned, and gave several examples to do this with an open mind. You spoke of how we should possibly break of being the prisoners of our own constructs that we create, which we are made to think and create. You gave examples of several instances from the Mahabharata and Ramayana with reference to international relations and the strategic thought process and the balance of power, and how practical IR lessons can be learned from all of them. Examples of International Yoga Day, focus on millets, have helped branding and changing the thought process of several across the globe is something which all of us are proud of. How you also spoke about how academic and intellectual rigor is important to make this change and the thought process happen. You finally spoke about the need for creating a body of knowledge to project the Indian strategic culture. You finally concluded by telling why Bharat needs a narrative. It was a fantastic keynote address, one of the best that I have heard. Thank you so much for your address and inspiring all the students who are here. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Raman. The inaugural session has now come to an end. I will request all of you to be seated. The next session will commence soon after this. I will request the dignitaries on the stage to join the audience. We're starting the session immediately. Please allow us 2 minutes to rearrange the stage.